Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first of 4 E3 workshops that we will run in 2022. Today, our focus is on anger and trauma. E3 stands for Encourage, Equip, and Empower. And through this series, our hope is to raise awareness of complex trauma's impact on those we care for and serve, and impact them in a positive way, and the help we provide leading to their capacity to take back control of their lives. I'm Bob Cameron. I'm the director of REACT Windsor Essex and one of today's moderators. And I introduce to you our second moderator, Kristen Stockford, who is REACT Windsor Essex program coordinator. And we are so pleased that you have joined us today for this informative interactive session.
Morning, everyone. As Bob mentioned, today's session is focused on anger and its source in trauma. We'll offer breakout room workshops on youth and trauma presented by Alex, Marie, and Jen of Excel. Bob will be speaking on spirituality and trauma, and Tamara Kowalska on anger and the nervous system. These will be presented at 10:20 for an hour. We'll also include some time for Q&A, and we'll give more details during the break at 10:15. As well as part of your registration, today's sessions will be available to you on the DWCC YouTube site. You can review them as of next week, and they will be accessible for the balance of this year. And we will email further information to you on how to access that after today's event.
So REACT Windsor Essex is an initiative of the Downtown Windsor Community Collaborative, which we began in October of 2020. REACT is a 12-week outpatient program that addresses the trauma that drives addictive behaviors, mental illness. So far, there's roughly been about 150 people that are currently involved in the program or have gone through the graduation of the 12-week program. We learn in the morning sessions of the 12 weeks to reparent ourselves within a safe community that we learn to trust. Cohort members can join into the cycle each Monday morning, and applications are online at www.reactwindsor.ca. So we have a full agenda today with our keynote speaker, Tim Fletcher, as the president and founder of the REACT program, who will work through 3 plenary sessions on anger and trauma. And to help us with that, it would be good if each of us wouldn't mind just using the mute button, and so that we can focus on hearing effectively from Tim and the speakers.
And before we begin, we acknowledge that today we meet on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of the First Nations, which includes the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. We respect the longstanding relationships with First Nations people in this place in the 100-mile Windsor-Essex Peninsula and the Straits Le Detroit of Detroit. We acknowledge our collective impact on the well-being of First Nations communities and hope that through E3, we deepen the capacity towards understanding and conciliation.
Tim Fletcher founded REACT in Winnipeg 15 years ago or so as a response to the growing awareness of the impact of complex trauma on addictions, mental and physical illnesses. This grew out of his exhaustive capacity to research and his extensive experience in pastoral and addictions counseling. We were excited last year when Tim and his wife, Kim, moved to Windsor in November of 2020, and not only support REACT Windsor Essex, but REACT programming in other cities across the country and online folks participating from around the world. So after each plenary session, there's time for Q&A. So please send your questions into Alex on the chat. Tim?
Oh, very good. Just let me share my screen with you. So basically what I want to say up front is I'm going to be presenting this as if I'm talking to professionals who are helping people with trauma issues, anger issues. But what I also realize is that as I'm teaching this, it's probably going to trigger some stuff in you as well. So it's going to have a very personal level, hopefully for many of you as we go through this. One of the things that is very fascinating to me is when I started in this field, and one of the first workshops that I began teaching the clients that I was working with had to do with anger. And I realized a couple things. So the first is that a lot of clients that I work with would say, I don't have any anger issues. And in their mind, they didn't. And that was because they had stuffed their anger so deep, they were unaware of it. Others, their response would be, yeah, I'm angry all the time, but I don't know why. And so there was like two extremes, from lots of anger to not feeling any anger. But then the other thing that I began to realize as I worked with clients was that a lot of the practical workshops out there on anger management weren't helpful for the people that I was working with, because their anger was different. Something was different. And it took me a while to be able to put it into words and figure it out. But the more I worked with people, the more I understood trauma, the more I began to understand that the anger related to complex trauma has a lot of similarities to anger of quote unquote normal people, but there's some very important differences. And therefore the counsel or teaching or practical tools often given in anger management workshops can have limited success in helping people with deep trauma when it comes to dealing with their angers. They need more tools than just the normal tools that are being given. And so that really set me on a journey of understanding this anger that comes out of trauma and understanding a toolkit that would be more effective in helping people deal with that anger. And so that's why, to me, this whole seminar came into being. But the other thing that I saw, and it's important to say up front, is sometimes a lot of the advice given to normal people around dealing with trauma can actually hurt people or not be good advice, be very bad advice to people with trauma with anger issues. And so there's some things that just have to be looked at from a very different perspective if we're going to be helpful to people with trauma with anger issues. So let's begin with what I often do with clients when I'm working with them. And I go scale of 1 to 10, talk about the amount of anger that was in your family of origin. And I have to be careful in kind of qualifying that for people, because for a lot of people, they go, we never fought, there was never any anger. And so they would say 0. So I go, no, I'm not talking about explosive anger as being the characteristic you're looking for as the measuring stick. I'm talking about the anger you sensed. Were people on guard, walking on eggshells? Did you have that anger vibe that you sense all the time? And for most people, they'll go, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. And so for most people who have complex trauma, the scale would be 7, 8, 9, 10 is what they would sense in their family of origin. And then I want them to go to the amount of anger in your own life over the past 7 years. And again, it's not your explosions, it's that deep burning away down inside of you anger. And then the amount of anger over the past 2 months. And then the latest anger experience. How intense did it get? Scale of 1 to 10, and what triggered it? So those are just 4 questions to help kind of get people thinking about their anger, but at a deeper level. Because a lot of people, what I've found from complex trauma, they tend to think of anger only in terms of explosions. And so they go, I don't explode, so I don't have anger issues. And so there needs to be questions that we can ask that help them to begin to go deeper into looking at maybe they do have some anger issues. So over the years, I've put together, why is this such a big issue for people from complex trauma? And it has many negative repercussions in their life. So what I have found over the years is for a lot of people, they would say, I don't have trauma. And so I can't start with them and helping them by saying, let's start with your trauma, because they don't think they have it. But they can say, yeah, I think maybe I got some anger problems. And so I can start there, and from there usually lead them to the trauma of childhood that would explain their anger issues. So anger issues is often a great starting point for getting people to become aware of deeper issues. So for many people from complex trauma, they end up in addiction. And once they're in recovery, if they get angry, that can be a big relapse trigger. So I'm mad at you, so I'm going to go get drunk. That'll make you pay for pissing me off. So it is a major relapse issue. Many in complex trauma realize that they have been angry for as long as they can remember. They just don't know why they're angry. And that's really important, I think, for people to understand, is they know they're angry, they just don't know where it came from. Many are afraid of their anger. So they think, I have to keep it bottled up, because if I ever let it out a little bit, I would be afraid of what would happen. That's how afraid they are of their anger. Why this is such an important entry point for many people is because they have so much guilt around their anger because of the damage they've done primarily to their kids when they're angry. And so they can be the most wonderful person in the world 98% of the time, but when their anger gets triggered, the damage they do in that brief moment of time undercuts all the 98% of good stuff they've done. And so they just have tremendous guilt about those minutes when their anger flares up. And so that leads to the difficulty they face in recovery in dealing with their anger, because anger is probably the most intense emotion that we experience, but it is also triggered, and we go from 0 to 100 or 0 to 1,000 in a nanosecond. So to say, just stop it or count to 10, that's almost silly advice to them, because that's a nanosecond where all of this happens. And it's almost in their minds an involuntary reaction. They don't know how to stop it in that nanosecond. And so that's why a lot of the advice just doesn't ring true for them, or it's just not practical for them. And so if we have to provide tools for them in that nanosecond, and that you have to understand up front is a huge challenge. And so this is not an easy issue for people to just get over or just change. It is massive because of that nanosecond and the triggers. And then the other thing is there's just so many triggers. If there's only 1 or 2 things that triggered their anger, then maybe they could begin to deal with it. But it's just, they got hundreds of things that trigger their anger. And so it's just a constant thing that they battle with. And so it's just not some minor little bad habit. This is a deeply entrenched thing that just nips at their heels all the time. I just have to make a little change. Okay. Some people, and this is, it's more of a minority, but it does happen a lot with more severe trauma. And that is that they are afraid of their anger because they go to a black rage. And it's when they're in that black rage, they don't even remember what they do. So there's an amnesia that goes with that black rage. it's a blackout really for them. And so they come out of it later and then they wonder what they did. And so there's a fear of going into this black rage that is very real for some people. Another one for many people is they begin to realize that they have become addicted to their anger. Something in them hates it, but something in them needs it, or it's their normal. They wouldn't know what to do without it. It's their default setting. It's just where their brain naturally goes. So they wake up, and if they're not angry, they somehow get themselves angry. That's what they need to do to get through the day. So many, and then with that, many realize they're just angry all the time. So partly because they're addicted to it, partly because that's just their normal, but they have to keep finding an excuse for why they're angry. So they're always blaming others for stuff, or they're focusing on negatives, they're focusing on things they don't like just to justify their anger. And then I think one of the big things that are important to understand with trauma and anger is that a lot of the anger that they have is eventually directed toward themselves. And that's due to the guilt, that's due to the shame. They don't like themselves, they hate all the stuff they've done. And so there's this need to find justice. So they have to punish themselves. So they turn their anger on themselves. And the result of that is it just does more and more damage. It doesn't solve anything, it just makes things worse. And that's hopefully what people are going to begin to realize is all these ways that they've used anger or what's happened with their anger is it just keeps making things worse. Okay. The next thing is so crucial to understand with complex trauma or complex PTSD. So what we're going to see in just a minute is anger was actually designed to be a good thing. Anger is designed to pull my thoughts, pull my feelings, emotions in a positive directions, to want to make positive changes. But what happens in complex trauma is the child tries to make positive changes, but nothing works, nothing helps, no positive comes. So the bad situations are never resolved. So then what begins to happen is the anger then pulls me in a negative direction. Well, then I'll fight or I'll flight. I'll isolate, I'll self-harm, I'll blame myself. And so over time, the anger emotion is no longer a positive force in their life. It becomes a very negative force. It pulls them strongly in a very negative direction. And that then means it's a downward spiral. It just keeps compounding problems and it never leads to solutions or resolutions. And so that's why for many people with trauma, anger is bad. That's the only way they look at it. And anger is bad. They can't see it as a good thing because in their life, it is only a negative thing. And so there's a lot of distortions with that, which hopefully will get cleared up as we go through the day. But just to understand that up front, anger has become a very negative thing. Okay, so let's move into how complex trauma affects the body, affects the anger, and makes it different from other anger. So Dr. Gabor Mate, who has influenced so much of my thinking around addiction, around trauma, around complex trauma, has written a book, When the Body Says No, and the hidden cost, or the cost of hidden stress. So it says, when we've been prevented from learning how to say no, our bodies may end up saying it for us. So here's the thesis. When you are in a negative situation where something is unloving or wrong, or you're in danger, anger kicks in, fear kicks in. That's a good thing. So what anger and fear say is this is wrong. So let's just say somebody tells you a lie, or somebody insults you or disrespects you, the child gets angry and says, this is wrong, this is hurtful. And so anger kicks in as a good thing, saying, I want to change this back to loving, because this is violating love. And if we stay with lies, if we stay with disrespect, it will eventually hurt the relationship big time, and it'll hurt me. So anger provides the desire and motivation to move something that is unhealthy back to healthy. This needs to change. But what happens if you can't resolve it? Well, then you're in a situation where it continues, you're lied to, you're disrespected, you're hurt, continues to be dangerous. So you continue to be in an unsafe place where you're angry, and that means you have cortisol in your brain. So let me just stop and say this. In regular trauma, you go into fight or flight and you resolve the problem, and cortisol stops pumping. So cortisol kicks in as soon as you're in danger to give you extra energy to fight or flight. And so usually it has anger with it. And that's to correct so you can resolve. What happens in complex PTSD is you can't resolve the situation. The child tries to make this a safer house. So the child tries to make so people aren't lying to me, disrespecting me, hurting me, but they can't. And so it is an unresolved danger, unresolved, unloving. So cortisol keeps on pumping. The key thing is the body was not designed for long-term cortisol release. It was designed for cortisol to only be used occasionally, very infrequently, and for short bursts, and to lead to resolving it. Then the body can go back to normal and be healthy. So what complex trauma does then is it causes this ongoing release of cortisol in the body. And so that, again, has stress and anger as part of it. And so what Dr. Gabor-Mate asks is the question, what does medically, what happens in the body when you have ongoing cortisol, when the body wasn't made for ongoing cortisol? And so the child then has to repress all that anger. They can't get angry or they get punished. So they have to live with unresolved injustice, unresolved love, unloving situations, unresolved lying, disrespect, all of that. They can't be angry about it, so they got to repress all of this cortisol. So what basically he's saying is, we now know it leads to major health problems and mental health problems. So there is more and more evidence being found through research to show Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, MS, IBS, irritable bowel cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, Alzheimer's, fibromyalgia. All of those can be tied back to suppressed cortisol in the body. So that's suppressed anger, suppressed stress that's never been able to be resolved. So just as a side note, there's 4 emotions that release cortisol in the body. So fear, stress, and anger, we just talked about, and depression. And depression basically puts you into fight, flight. I can't handle this. Life is overwhelming. I want to get out of here. And so those are the 4 things that release ongoing cortisol. And if they can't be resolved in a hurry, they begin to do damage to the body. So that's the quote that he gives, that repression is not relegating to your unconscious realm these emotions. So it disorganizes and confuses our psychological defenses, so that in some people, these defenses go awry, becoming the destroyers of health rather than the protectors. So in other words, cortisol is not good, repressing anger, which adds stress to the body, which is more cortisol. All of that operates at the subconscious, but it's doing a lot of damage. So they did, through the research, 40% of cancer patients have experienced the death of a parent. So that's just one trauma event. that they are connecting to cancer that happens in the life of a person. So I've talked about this, and this is the second thing. So the first thing then, complex trauma is suppressed cortisol. Now I want to go into more detail on kind of the anger. So I've already talked about this, is that anger is originally designed to be a very good, healthy emotion. It is to correct any situation that violates dishonesty, disrespect, injustice. So it gives you the energy and motivation to correct unloving behaviors so that it can be resolved. And so the cortisol goes with it. So we've talked about that. So here is the key thing. Complex trauma, what makes it trauma is it can't be resolved. And the problem with that is you cannot then resolve the cortisol release. It has to keep pumping because you're still in danger. Stuff still isn't right. And you can't resolve the anger. You have to stuff it down. And so what I want you to see then is, if you think of a volcano, and I'll just jump to that, what begins to happen is you build up lava of all this stuffed down anger that you can't resolve, you can't express. And so it just begins to simmer below the surface, often in a subconscious world. Then what happens when a person gets to be an adult is, if they run into a situation where love is violated, well, it just triggers all of that lava, and there's often an expression or an eruption of the volcano, and cortisol is released again. One of the things that does sometimes happen, though, with children is they can't express their anger at home. They've got all this lava bubbling away. So what they will do is find something weaker than themselves and vent their anger on that. So they'll become a bully to other kids at school, or they'll develop cruelty to animals, or vandalism, or arson. So one of the, again, studies have shown that children who can't resolve their problems at home, so they have ongoing trauma at home because they're not safe, have all this suppressed anger. These are the children that become the bullies, the vandals, harm animals, and arson. The other thing that happens with CPTSD is that the child becomes stuck in that extreme response. So they want to go to fight or flight because that's the survival mode. And so now, as an adult, because they couldn't express that, now that they, as a kid, now that they're an adult and they can go into fight or flight, they go into fight big time. So for a lot of kids growing up, when they were angry, they went into flight or freeze. Once they become an adult, they can go into fight, but they go into an overreaction. So they go to full on stress activation mode in their limbic brain as soon as they get triggered. And that's part of the problem for them today. So their ways of responding to anger can change from a child to an adult, but they bring the trauma response of full on activation at the slightest little trigger once they become an adult. Another aspect that can happen in childhood. So we see that anger happens when a child is living in unsafe, unloving circumstances, and they can't express it, so they stuff it down. But some children don't stuff it. They become angry children. And that can happen in homes where they're never paid attention to if they're good, they're neglected. The only time they ever get seen or heard is when they're angry. And so anger becomes their way of being seen and heard. So I'd rather get attention for being bad because I'm not getting any attention for being good. So getting attention for being bad is better than no attention at all, is really what it boils down to for them. So we've talked about the other things. So let me go on then to the common response that I get from clients. Well, I don't have anger issues because I'm not an exploder. And so what they think is the only people with anger problems are those who explode. The volcano erupts. They go crazy. They lose it. They have temper tantrums. They see those are angry people. I never do that, so I don't have anger issues. So what's important for people to understand is there's 3 other ways that we express anger that also point to the same kind of anger issues and the same kind of anger problems as the exploder. So the first would be those who stuff their anger deep down and even deny it to themselves. They're not even aware of it. And so in some ways they disconnect from the emotion of anger. But what's important to realize for people like that is it's still affecting them, and it affects them in ways that are physical often. They can have high blood pressure, trouble sleeping, obsessive thinking, constant irritability. So those are often people who have thought they've stuffed their anger and it's vanished, but it hasn't. It's still there affecting them. The next one is that they turn their anger on themselves. They punish themselves. And so what they've been taught to believe often is if dad's angry, dad will say, it's your fault. You made me angry. And so whenever anybody's angry, they think I've done something wrong. If ever anybody's sad, they think it must be my fault. I've done something wrong. If a relationship ends, it must be my fault. They get blamed for everything. Even if they were sexually abused, their mom said, well, what did you do to attract that attention? It was their fault. So they have all this, and this is important to understand, false guilt. They're made to feel guilty for stuff that where they've never done anything wrong, but they've been made to feel they have. And so now, whenever anybody's sad, upset, anything goes wrong anywhere, they begin to think I've done something wrong. Or if they do actually fail, let their kids down, hurt their kids, hurt their partner, then I have to beat myself up. So their default setting is if I'm not feeling mad at myself for something, then something's wrong. So I need to feel bad about myself all the time. Some take that to the extent of self-harm, pulling their hair, cutting, burning, banging their head, risky behaviors, flirting with suicide. If it happens, it happens. But that's anger that's turned inward. And that is a big, big ball that is very complicated to deal with. But it is common in almost everybody with complex trauma. And then the final one is what we call underhanded or passive aggressive. And so that's the person who acts like they're never angry, but they're sneaky in how they express their anger. So they use sarcasm. So they put little barbs in a joke. And if somebody says, oh, did you mean, oh no, I just joking. So they can always camouflage their anger to make it look like they're being funny or they're not angry at all, but they're still hoping it hurts the other person or pays them back. And then you get the sneaky, the silent treatment, the pouting, the one-word answers. So you look up upset today. Is anything bothering you? No. Do you want to talk about it? No. It's obvious something's bothering you? No. And that's all you're going to get. Or they withhold love. They just pull away from you. They close their heart from you. They treat you coldly. Or the person who is so expert and sneaky is they walk around pushing buttons, so that if they know that you are super punctual and they're mad at you, they will just show up 5 minutes late. And then they go, oh, sorry, I got held up in traffic. Meanwhile, they purposely did it because they knew it would piss you off. And then when you're angry, they go, oh man, you got some anger issues you need to look at, when really they're just bloating inside because they finally expressed their anger, but they look like they're not angry at all. So those are different ways people express their anger. So what I then want people to realize is, for many people with complex trauma, their anger actually follows a sequence. So when something upsets them, instead of confronting it or talking about it in an assertive way, they originally stuff it, or they blame themselves. I must be doing something wrong. And they turn their anger inward. Then after a while, they start to go underhanded. They use sarcasm, they pout, they withhold love, they try to punish the person in subtle ways. And then it builds, and then finally they explode. And so for many people, I want them to see that there are patterns to their anger, but there's anger at work all the time. They're just not aware of some parts of the pattern. And so it's often helpful for them to realize the different types of how we express anger and be able to identify that in themselves. So just comically, what many people will do at the end of this workshop is they'll come to me and say, well, before I started this workshop, I had 0 anger. Now my anger's at a 10 and I'm mad at you. And it's partly because they've begun to realize they've had anger there all the time. They just denied it or never seen it before. But what I want them to realize is, I'm not telling you this just to get you angry. I'm telling you this so you can begin to identify it, because as long as it's not identified, it's hurting you and others. It's doing damage. And so you can continue to stick your head in the sand and say, I don't have anger issues, and keep doing damage, or you can begin to understand it and face it. Okay, one other part to this that to me is very important to understand with complex trauma. So we saw that anger starts out as a very good thing. It's a great emotion. It's a positive emotion. It's designed to protect us, to protect relationships. But in complex trauma, it gets messed up. It gets distorted, and it becomes a negative force. What happens to children in complex trauma is not just what I described, but they begin to realize that anger can also be used for other purposes. It can be used as a weapon or as a shield. And so they begin to develop other purposes for anger in their life. And it's important for them to begin to understand some of those purposes, because what you're going to find in working with clients is they hate their anger, but they can't give it up because it still plays a role in their life. It still, in their mind, has a valuable role, even though they hate it. And so until they can develop tools to meet the role that anger is playing, they're going to continue to need to depend on anger and have trouble letting it go. And so it's important for them to begin to understand the different unhealthy roles that anger has played in their life. So the first is they use it to intimidate or control others. So anger is a great way of manipulating people. If you don't get what you want, get angry. And then all of a sudden everybody's, okay, I'll give you what you want, just don't get mad. And so anger becomes a great way of manipulation, intimidating and controlling other people. And if you don't have any other tools to get your needs met, then anger becomes an important tool to get what you want or to get your needs met. A second one is it medicates other emotions. And so that's why it's sometimes called a secondary emotion. So if I ask clients this all the time, when somebody tells you your zipper's undone, or you stumble and fall in a crowd of people and you feel embarrassed, how long do you stay embarrassed before you become angry? And they go, less than a second. So as soon as you feel embarrassment, I don't like feeling embarrassment, let's medicate embarrassment with another emotion, anger. So if I feel anger, I don't feel embarrassed. And so anger becomes an important medicator of other unpleasant emotions. And so I start to take clients through other unpleasant emotions that they might feel. I feel disrespected, I feel rejected, I feel hurt, I feel abandoned. I don't want to feel any of those, so I'm going to go to anger, and I'm just going to focus on being angry. So that becomes an important role in their life for anger, is the medicating value that it has. Another thing that comes out of complex trauma is, for many people, they have a very unhealthy boundary system taught to them, or very few or no boundaries taught to them. So they were never able to say no to their parents and set boundaries with their parents or their brothers and sisters. So they could put big signs on the door, private, keep out, and their parents would not respect those boundaries. They would just walk into the room. They would read their diary. They would blab their stories. They just did not respect the child's no. And so a child was made to feel guilty for having needs, for standing up for themselves, for wanting to have a boundary. And so they learned to basically shut down their needs, shut down standing up for themselves. And that is what we call shame. And so the only way they knew to set a boundary is to blow up or to isolate. So I'll create a boundary by running away from everybody, or I'll create a boundary by blowing up. So anger became a necessary tool to drive people away, to create some space, to give myself a boundary. The problem for most people with complex trauma who created a boundary that way is afterwards they felt guilt for driving people away, for being so hurtful. And so they fold all the boundaries and they let people walk all over them again. And so what happens for many people with complex trauma, even in adult life, is they start a yo-yo effect. They create a boundary by blowing up, then they feel guilty and they let people walk all over them and use them until they can't take it anymore. Then they blow up and they drive everybody away again. And it's that ongoing yo-yo effect. Another important part, a role that anger has played for many people, is it's a way for them to hurt people back who hurt them. So they weren't allowed to resolve a conflict in healthy ways. They weren't allowed to work through the real issues. So people were allowed to hurt them and they just were supposed to take it. And so often one of the ways that they hurt people back was to get angry back. And then an important role that anger played for many people is it gave them energy. And so you can imagine that, so cortisol is, again, what is necessary in fight or flight and survival mode to give us energy to fight or flight. So it's connected to adrenaline. And so it gives us all of that. But when that's constantly pumping in your brain, you basically begin to get adrenal fatigue. You begin to get exhausted. Your sympathetic nervous system is working all the time. Your parasympathetic never gets a chance to bring back balance and rejuvenation to your body and all the systems of your body. And so you begin to head towards burnout. And so for some people, the way that they get up in the morning, they just still feel exhausted, even though they've slept well. The way they get energy again is, I need to get angry. anger will somehow get some adrenaline going again and help me get through the day. And it'll give me energy to clean. I clean the house so much better when I'm angry than when I'm not angry. And so anger became an important energy source for them in their life of feeling exhausted all the time. And then another key one is that it's a shield, a protector. So complex trauma, people hurt me all the time. I can't do anything about it. I can't run away from my mom and dad, my uncle. So what do I do to protect my heart is I have to stay angry. And then when they get into recovery, it's still, well, if I stay angry, it keeps me sharp. It keeps my guard up. So when I'm angry, I'm more alert to people who might want to hurt me. And I've been hurt way too much in my life. I don't want to get hurt again. So I need anger to keep my edge, to keep me sharp so I don't get hurt again. And that becomes such an important protective role that anger plays. Another role that it plays is when people are in complex trauma, they are in a situation they can't resolve as a child. They are truly victims. They feel helpless and powerless. They've tried everything to fix the problem and they can't fix it. And so what happens when many get to be adults is they carry that victim mentality with them. They still feel like the powerless, helpless 5-year-old. And so when they're confronted with problems, they just feel helpless to fix them. And so instead of realizing, no, I'm not a 5-year-old anymore, I do have tools today, I do have support, I'm not helpless, they still hang on to the helplessness. And so then now they have to justify their bad decisions that they make because they stay in that helpless mode. So anger becomes a way of, now I can blame somebody. I'm so angry, it's their fault. And so anger becomes, again, a way of allowing me to stay a victim, but to blame somebody else for my decisions. And then, I think we're almost done here, and then we'll open it up to questions, is for many people with unresolved anger, it turns into more than just unresolved anger. It turns into resentment. And by that, I mean, they don't just have a lot of anger there, they close their heart. They are not letting people in. You hurt me, there's no way I'm going to try to resolve it because it's never been resolvable. So this is how I am going to protect myself. I am going to see you negatively and close my heart to you. 4 final ones. I always ask clients, when you are angry, how many of you feel that you might be wrong? And they all say no, because when we're angry, it creates an immediate feeling that I'm right. And so it feeds self-righteousness. Everybody else is wrong at that moment in time. And so our thinking gets distorted, but it feeds a self-righteousness. And so a lot of people hang on to anger because it continues to feed, I'm better than you. And that's a sad thing. Sadly, for some, their anger became their identity. I remember working with a client who was associated with Hell's Angel, was an enforcer, was known for his anger, his ability to fight the damage and hurt he could do to others. And he came into my office one day crying and he said, I don't know who I'd be if I'd give up my anger, because it's become who I am. It's my identity. It's what got me respect. And if I give up my anger, I feel people will see me as weak. I don't know who I am, and I feel people won't respect me. And so that was a key part of anger for him, was his identity. Another one is, if I'm angry and blaming everybody, I never have to look at myself. So if I'm angry all the time, it's a way of avoiding looking at myself. And if I'm angry, I don't need anybody. And so it's a way to convince self that everybody else is a screw up. I don't need anybody. And I can continue in my solitary, isolating ways. So that's an introduction to how complex trauma takes this anger subject to a totally different level. We'll open it up now to questions. You're on mute, Kristen.
Thank you. I did a great spiel and you missed it. Thank you, Tim, for that presentation. And, you know, so often we see the anger that's on the surface, and information like this gives us all a little more insight into what may be driving it underneath. So as Tim mentioned, we will open it up for some Q&A. We did have a couple questions come in. So is it possible for someone to become addicted to cortisol? When we hear the energy it gives and some of the things that may seem like benefits, is it possible to then become addicted to that excess cortisol?
Yes, I found it very interesting a couple of years ago to read both Gabor Mate and I can't remember the other writer, I think it was Bruce Perry, Dr. Bruce Perry, who both talked about evidence being in now through brain research that the brain can become what we would call addicted or dependent on cortisol. So it needs that to feel normal. It keeps subconsciously wanting to produce it in order to feel normal. And so I think for many people, what I would say is if they're drug, alcohol addicts or gambling, food addicts, those are very significant addictions to get sobriety from, to get kind of on the road to recovery. But for many, the anger addiction one is even tougher. And so it's important for people to begin to look honestly at, have I become addicted to cortisol or anger?
Thank you. Another question that came in is there a connection between ADD, ADHD, and anger?
Yes. So ADD, ADHD are part of the anxiety disorder spectrum. Dr. Gabor Mate in his book, Scattered Minds, Bruce Perry again in his book, What Happened to You, both cite research that are now pointing us in the direction that ADD, ADHD really come out of complex trauma in most cases. So a child that has trouble focusing because they're worried about what's happening in their life, what's going to happen tonight, what happened last night. But the hyperactivity part and the attention deficit part can be because they've got all this cortisol running through their body, which says, I need to get rid of this. I need to be in high activity to burn this up because it's put me into fight or flight mode. And you ask me to sit still and concentrate. No, cortisol doesn't allow me to do that. And so cortisol actually shuts down the thinking part of the brain. So basically it says we don't have time to think right now. We need to get out of our cortex into the limbic brain to fight or flight. So we can get into protection. And so the more cortisol and adrenaline is pumping, studies are showing the lower your IQ gets, the less you are able to think clearly, the more your cortex goes offline. And so that makes it hard to concentrate when you've got cortex adrenaline going through your brain. So definitely it's part of ADD and ADHD.
Thank you. Another one that came in, is it safe to assume that trauma can be based on the individual's perception and others around them did not see the events from the same perspective, to the point that Angry people often feel they are 100% right in their anger and can't hear they might have been wrong. What is an appropriate way to engage people in that mode?
So great question. So kind of two questions. So trauma is both the event and the perception of the event. So yes, some children, if you look at a school that's burning, you could have it's burning, the fire's taking place in one classroom. So the children in that classroom are going to see it differently than a child at the other end of the school or the firefighter who's coming to fight the fire. Each of the three is going to have a different perception of the fire, but only to one is it traumatic. And so perception is such a key part of whether a person ends up traumatized or not. When it comes to, if you're in a relationship and the other person's angry, it's almost impossible to reason with that person at that time. To try to reason is reasoning with somebody who's irrational because their cortex is shut down, they're self-righteous. And so you have to wait until there's a de-escalation. And we're going to talk about that in our final talk today. You can't make any progress until the de-escalation takes place. And so that's why if you're in a relationship, you need to build in some rules or understandings as a couple as to how you're going to de-escalate before you attempt to resolve the conflict. The other factor that is so important, and this is tricky and I don't want to get into it totally, is a narcissist who is angry thinks they're right. The problem is a narcissist, once he's de-escalated, still thinks he's right. And so you have to figure out if you're in a relationship, am I relationship with somebody who acts like a narcissist, but once they de-escalate, they're no longer a narcissist. I can have a fruitful discussion and resolve it. Or am I in a relationship with somebody who acts like a narcissist and is still a narcissist once they de-escalate? Very different, very different. Okay.
Next question. How long would it take for someone to get over trauma that they never knew they had?
And so basically what we're finding is it depends on kind of how early the trauma started. In other words, how early did your brain begin to go into a trauma response coping strategy? And for some that can start from birth, from 1, from 2, from 3. It depends on the age you start. Because the younger you started, the longer it takes to relearn. Because all of what you learned at that age is now your autopilot. It's your subconscious programming that you're not even aware of. So basically what I say to people is what we know in healing from complex trauma, which is ongoing trauma from living in a dangerous environment, which isn't necessarily abuse type danger. It can be just neglect. You don't feel that anybody's there for you or really cares for you or sees you or gets you or accepts you. All of those create the same feelings inside of a child. It can take 2 to 10 years of lots of hard work to begin to really heal. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean you're not going to see any positive results until 2 years are done or 10 years are done. You can start seeing positive results in the first month of starting to work on your trauma. But understand this, though you start seeing positive results, many things get worse before they get better when you're dealing with complex trauma. But within 6 months, you usually start to see positive as the main thing that is happening. But we'll add one more thing. Healing from trauma does not follow a straight line upward. Healing from trauma is up, down, up, down, up, down. You do good, fall flat on your face, feel like you've not learned anything. So it's making progress, regressing. And that's because you're fighting against deep subconscious programming. And so it's very slow and messy growth. And so you have to really understand that. Otherwise, people get discouraged because they think they should be making this constant upward climb, and it just does not work like that. And often the greatest problems, you don't fall on your face the most until you're in your intimate relationships. That's where your deepest issues get triggered. And that's when it feels like you haven't learned anything at all. And so it's very slow, messy, and intimate relationships are the toughest part of the growth part.
Do you have suggestions for parents in helping children walk the balance between acknowledging anger and not denying?
Okay. Tamara, you had your hand up. Did you want to just share from what I just shared?
Thank you so much. I actually, that was an interesting question. And my curiosity is in twofold. First is that person, I don't know, I can't see the name, but what does getting over trauma look like? And the second question is, I'm very curious. I mean, if this is a personal question, for sure, I wouldn't want anyone to share anything that they weren't comfortable with, but how do you know that you've suffered from trauma if you didn't know you had trauma? So I'm wondering what is coming up for that person in their present life, which is indicating to them that there was some trauma, because that's where your clue is, right? That's where your portal, your entry into healing is going to be. And I think that it's also really, really important for us to understand what getting over or healing means, because how do we know if we're succeeding if we don't know what that looks like? So I just wanted to throw that in if we have time.
Yeah, thank you. And let me speak to that. Part of basically my work has been answering that question. And so we've prepared a complex trauma test of 60 different characteristics of complex trauma. So what does fight, flight, freeze look like? And so 60 different characteristics of fight, flight, freeze that are prevalent. And so people with trauma who don't realize they have it can take the test and go, wow, I got 50 of these characteristics. None of these are healthy characteristics. I wonder why. And that can be the portal into starting to understand the trauma. So complex trauma is a child not feeling safe because of abuse, neglect, abandonment, their needs not consistently being met. And so in the first seminar, we spent a lot of time developing that. What does healing look like? That becomes just as big a question, or how can I tell I'm healing? And so one of the things that I would say just at this point with this is part of complex trauma is you've been wounded in hundreds and hundreds of different ways growing up. Those wounds become your triggers in adult life. They cause you to get angry. They cause you to want to isolate, want to harm yourself, want to drink, whatever. So you're still going to get triggered for years and years, but as you grow, you're going to respond differently to the triggers. Instead of going back to the old unhealthy behaviors you would have gone to in the past, you now go to a new behavior that is healthy. You reach out, you connect, you're kind to yourself, you're assertive, you confront and have conflict in healthy ways. So there's all these different marks of healing that now begin to be the responses to the trauma. Not that you do them perfectly, but you're gradually more and more doing them. And then you don't get triggered as often because you're working on yourself and you're healing. And when you are triggered, you're able to kind of process it and get to healthy faster. And that becomes such an important part. Okay, so the other question was parents with children. What I say to parents who have complex trauma and anger as an issue is be honest with your kids. Don't blame them for your anger. Own your stuff and work on yourself. Your children, if they see that you are working on yourself and are growing, they can forgive you for some of your anger bouts if they're getting less and less, if you're not blaming them, if you're talking about it. The problem is if you're not owning your stuff, if you're blaming them, and if you're not growing or changing, then they gradually lose respect for you, no matter how smart you say you are, how much you say you're working on yourself. They aren't convinced because they don't see it in action in their home. So this is where, to me, probably the hardest part of dealing with anger is, because anger is so intense in that nanosecond for somebody with deep complex trauma, that does not change overnight. And so you can continue to hurt your kids periodically for a long time, is basically what it boils down to. If the kids see, though, that you're hurting them less each time and less frequently, and that you are changing, then they can have forgiveness. Now, what usually happens to kids is they've got anger now themselves, and they love you and hate you at the same time, and they want to hurt you back. And so get ready for the fact that your kids might love you but have a resentment towards you because of all this damage you've done. And so owning your part and changing becomes such an important way forward with that.
Thank you. Are you aware of the connections, relationships between angry mobs, groupthink, and trauma bonding?
Yes. So groupthink is what many angry moms do, which is, this is what we think in this family. This is the way it is. This is the way it is. And so everybody in this family, we all agree, we all think the same way. And that easily comes out in anger because you're looking for support for the fact that I'm right and you're wrong. So that's part of that. Trauma bonding is, we don't connect over necessarily healthy things, we connect over our pain. And that's how we connect. And so for some people, their anger is part of their trauma connection. And so if we both get really angry and have a really big fight, then we connect afterwards. And I'll talk about that in the next session a bit more.
When doing the healing work, can we heal and stop the continued cortisol release? Can we reverse, lessen effects, or heal from chronic illness?
Yes, so what we found, and we'll make this the last question, I think, unless there's one more, but what we found is once a person gets to a safe relationship in a safe place, the cortisol stops. They don't need cortisol anymore. And once the cortisol stops pumping, then the brain starts to heal, the body can start to heal. But what happens in adult life is that often it's not just kind of the circumstances of childhood, the lack of safety that cause the cortisol. Now in adult life, it's stress that keeps the cortisol happening. And so part of getting healthy is not just being in a safe relationship, it's managing my stress levels, which means learning to say no. It means learning self-care, learning to take care of my needs. If I'm able to do that, plus have safe relationships, then the cortisol can stop. Then the benefits in my body will begin to happen and my brain can heal.
Thanks. And we have time for one more quick question before we move on to our workshops. So anger is a healthy innate response, innate limbic or cortex response?
Limbic, and we'll get into that in the next session.
Wonderful.
I want to look at anger in the brain, and there's actually going to be, Tamara's doing a workshop around kind of anger in the brain, which is very good. So.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim, and thanks to everyone for all your questions.